Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. We now move to one of the most awaited session of the day, keynote address by the Honorable Finance Minister of India, Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman ji, on India's G20 Presidency, restoring global macro stability, improving financial inclusion, and reforming the multilaterals. Along with Honorable Minister, we have on the dais Mr. Pramod Bhasin, Chairman ICRIER, Dr. Deepak Mishra, Director and Chief Executive ICRIER, and Dr. Shankaracharya, Honorary Professor ICRIER and former Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India. Before I invite Honorable Minister to deliver her address, may I request our Director and Chief Executive, Dr. Deepak Mishra, for his welcome remarks.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Honorable Finance Minister Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman, our esteemed speakers and panelists of the conference, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad that many of you have stayed back to hear the Finance Minister and so many of us who are connected online. I think about 80 people are connected online. So let me once again welcome you all to ICRIER'S 14th Annual International G20 Conference. As I said in the morning, ICRIER has been hosting this conference for a very long time, since 2009, and more with our collaborators with the IMF and ADB Institute. But this year conference assumes a special significance for at least 3 reasons. The first is this is the last major conference before India assumes the G20 presidency. So if you want to get to know how India's presidency is going to look like, you must be here in this room. And I'm glad that many of you stayed back to hear to the Finance Minister, who will be talking about some of the finance sector priorities that India is thinking about. The second is almost all the key architects of the G20 presidency for India are part of today's lecture series. We have already heard from India's G20 Sherpa. We also heard from the G20 Chief Coordinator, and we'll soon be hearing from Honorable Finance Minister, and then in the afternoon from Niti Aayog Vice Chairperson, Mr. Suman Berry. And finally, as you have already noticed, this is a conference which is a difference compared to what other G20 conferences have been in the past. And that's to do with the theme that we chosen for this conference, which is crafting an Indian narrative on resilient, inclusive, and sustainable economy. In short, what we call RISE. And we hope and believe that as India's assumption of G20 presidency will mark the rise of the Indian economy, the rise of the developing countries' voice in the global economic diplomacy, and the rise of the global economy from the depth of a prolonged economic crisis caused by a pandemic, a ravaging war, and an unprecedented inflation crisis. So we had a very interesting session, 2 very interesting sessions so far. In the morning, we talked about macro financial issues, which were the speakers were Dr. Anant Nageshwaran, Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Poonam Gupta from NCAR, and Mr. Ramanath Srinivasan from RBI. And we had 2 discussants from the IMF resident representative and an official from the Ministry of Finance. I think just for the Finance Minister recap, I just wanted to mention that some of the issues that were mentioned in this discussion were about managing global macro spillovers, debt vulnerabilities, how do we build global safety nets for economic crisis, and reforming of the multilateral institutions, especially the Bretton Woods systems. India's G20 presidency also marks an important milestone for ICRIER. We are proud to be the G20 knowledge partner for the Ministry of Finance, Commerce, Power, and Department of Telecommunication, as well as working very closely with Sherpa's office. We have a dedicated website on G20 issues and a exclusive Twitter handle. As ICRIER, we are delighted to be part of G20 Economic Festival that is about to sweep this nation. So without much ado, let me turn to Honorable Finance Minister to deliver the keynote address of the event. Often dubbed as the most powerful woman in India, Ms. Sitharaman has broken many glass ceilings in her career, most prominent being the first full-time woman finance minister in India. I think she will be best remembered for being at the helm of economic affairs in India when the world faced a triple whammy of a pandemic, a war, and an inflation crisis. While in the past, India had caught a cold every time the global economy sneezed, it was during Ms. Sitharaman's time that India has managed to remain an island of stability in the ocean of turbulence. We are delighted that the FM has agreed to find time within an extremely tight schedule to join us and deliver the keynote address. And the way we'll proceed is after the FM gives a speech, I'll request Dr. Shankaracharya, our Honorable Professor ICRIER, to moderate the session and take some questions from the floor. And then I'll turn to our chairperson, Pramod Bhasin, to give the vote of thanks. So with that, let me introduce Madam Finance Minister to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, particularly at a time when we're getting closer to actually starting the 12-month period of India's presidency. But I feel that you've already had a good dose of discussion on this topic from the morning. And people who are actually at the core phase working to deliver on the G20 India presidency have already addressed you all. Whilst that gives me a sense of comfort that if I'd missed something, they would have captured it. If I have said something, I probably only am reiterating it. And there's not much of a newer point that I need to bring in here. But equally, I'm not sure if any one of them had given a disclaimer, which I think is important for me to put right up front. And that is, we are almost at the fag end of all the consultations and discussions and officially to release what would be India's priorities. So everything that any one of us is speaking here is subject to additions and deletions. So it's all right to have some meat and some flesh and some bones and everything else into the structure and add getting ready for G20. But we have really not yet launched officially our tagline, our logo, whatever lines of, branding ourselves or stating with certain authority our priorities. So with that disclaimer right up front, I'll certainly give you the larger canvas of what we are talking about, probably mostly reflecting everything that I had said in the acceptance speech during the Fund Bank meetings in Washington recently. So where is India now? And at what time is India taking over the presidency? That actually is going to be very instrumental in delivering on what we want to do, in carrying forward some of the earlier presidency's agenda, and facing a turbulent global situation, which again will have to learn a lot from what Indonesia's 12 months have been like, because they've gone through a lot of pushes and pulls, but yet had to keep moving ahead, moving forward, so that the G20 and its institutional strengths are not lost out on. So we'll be drawing on a lot of lessons based on the Indonesian presidency. So where is India? Already, I think some indication has been given by Deepak. We are probably at a very comfortable stage in the sense of comparing with other economies. Our macroeconomic fundamentals are fine. Fine is a very relative term here. And I'm conscious I have a good presence of very thinking representatives of the media. Oh, the finance minister said India is in a fine. No, please. Everything is in a relative sense. So I want to be sure that we get the calibrations in every one of the adjectives that I use, frame it in a context, and rather than pushing some headline story, which for 2 days it can capture some audience, but it'll obviously will be very strongly pushed back from my side, because I take a lot of liberty while speaking with you and with the institutions like ICRIER, because all of us will have to work together to make sure that India's presidency actually does a lot of good work. One, to strengthen the multilateral institutions, make sure we are able to get a good deliverable out of the presidency, because India is in a very, very unique position, having very carefully trodden on an independent position in today's global geopolitical situation. So it's not just the old-fashioned non-alignment, but in a multipolar world. Non-alignment is all right when you're talking about two poles and you're trying to be somewhere in the middle. Today, that middle is among several poles, and it's also a very dynamic middle. So India is constantly, very carefully maintaining its position and voicing for the emerging markets, voicing for the low and middle income countries, and trying to make sure that all our voices are heard, particularly at a time when we are also facing the collateral spillovers, which are, I would like to believe, unintended, but the spillovers nevertheless. So the kind of things that India would prioritize on will also have something to say on, or will also prioritize on, speaking about the spillovers themselves. How much can countries like India, or countries who are in the middle income bracket, or countries like low income countries, or in some other form redefined emerging markets, can bear the brunt of the spillovers? And how can you be ready? Can you at all be ready for unpredictable spillovers? And how much can you be ready? And therefore, spillovers will certainly be one of the priorities. Discussion on that will certainly be one of the priorities. Whether in the ranking order of priorities, spillovers become first or the last is anyone's guess. But these are issues which are going to be given an added value to the priorities which are being discussed. So in many features, many priority points, spillovers will come in anyway to say, how do we face this? And similarly, if you're talking about multipolar world, the multilateral organizations themselves, particularly the development banks themselves, have quite a few reforms which have been pending. They're not reflective of the membership and their subscription weightage. And if that is also something which we need to take up, again, there it becomes important to understand that we are going to be in the G20 presidency. And this is going to be a very strange coincidence, a good, happy coincidence, that the Troika is now emerging market Troika. And at no point in time that the Troika has been emerging markets only. And if it is so, then shouldn't the voice of the emerging markets find a legitimate priority place? And what are the agendas then, therefore, coming from the emerging markets? So that's also something which will feature, flavor, add to the spirit of the conversations, I suppose, in the G20 during our presidency. So the emerging market voice, the middle of the road, which is a dynamic middle of the road, you're constantly navigating through it. The spillovers are all going to constantly play into every one of the priorities that you might set forth. And strictly by, let's say, the culture and the tradition of G20, you're also going to make sure that you'll carry forward some of the earlier presidencies and their agenda, which still need more time to be discussed, taken forward, and brought to a logical conclusion. So those agenda points will also come into play during our presidency. And the G20, I would think, which came out with the necessity for having a group like that, essentially to talk about the finance related matters, has now got a slightly widened mandate through the Sherpa track. You're bringing in so many other different points. Engagements, the elements of engagements with the women's groups, NGOs, elite, and so on, the industry, small and medium industry, and so on, is a parallel track that I'm not going to spend much time on. So you're already looking at a G20, which recently has proven that a group like that can, at a time of stress also, deliver on some of its priority points. When I say this, I mean the global tax, which is still yet to be set, rolled out. But the taxation, the global taxation, a topic of great relevance for today, a topic in which getting countries together has been possible, a topic on which, unless many countries came together, it is impossible for any one country, be they emerging market or advanced, to implement and to have a consensus. There can always be countries which feel differently about the agreement. Members who have gone into the agreement willingly also require and ask for fine-tuning of it. But never mind, the recent past, G20 proved that it is capable of bringing that consensus on a contentious issue like taxation, and therefore proved that it is possible, if mind is applied, it is possible to have G20 like forum, move forward and build consensus. And that is where I think India's presidency has a lot more, because it can bring in that consensus on few other issues which are very critically important. Not only the global taxation, but also the pandemic preparedness element, where you're looking at financing and health together. You don't want to be scrambling for resources like the way you did in 2020, in case there is a, God forbid, but in case there is a future pandemic. So that high-powered committee, and then the G20 going to it, and then looking at a way in which we can have some kind of a pandemic preparedness fund, so that it can, be strengthening all our attempts in case there is a future pandemic. So the G20 has clearly showed that in the recent past, it has brought nations together, consensus is possible to build up, and also effectively bring in those measures which is required by countries across the board. So it is not a country's agenda, it is not a country's issue, but across the board, all of us need that kind of a support. So G20 has sort of proven that, and we are therefore necessarily going to have to keep that record of the G20 intact and see if we can also, during our presidency, build consensus on other issues which are of relevance and critical importance at the moment. So in this background, if I'm talking about issues which the G20 during our presidency will have to prioritize, I would highlight about 8 of them, all of which are not yet, as I said, the final word on it. We are still sort of seeing if we can take on some more, drop some, refocus, and so on. So these are matters for discussion that I'm putting forth before you, not that the finance minister has set forth the G20 India presidency's priorities. No, I'm not setting forth the priorities. So the first thing which actually comes to my mind is, much before I mention the point on discussion, the way in which the G20, other than the global tax, other than the pandemic preparedness related fund issue, we have actually dealt with the debt related matters of countries and very surely provided relief to countries which were under stress. So in providing liquidity through the allocation of the special drawing rights, the G20 actually showed that during a pandemic, which got aggravated because of the debt situation of the countries, that was not purely pandemic related debt, but debt which had accumulated even prior to the pandemic, but which got aggravated during the pandemic. We were able to come up with some kind of relief for many of the countries, some of which were middle income countries, which rapidly deteriorated to being low income countries because of the stress and the volume of debt. We had come up with some relief, but it actually highlights the need for reigniting the debate on sustainable development goals. To what extent will development and the need for financing development will take us to a situation where you become so indebted? And can sustainable development goals be reached? We are, after all, only 8 years away from it. Can sustainable development goals be reached by financing ourselves like that, that we end up not developing our resources or assets, but more indebted? And that kind of non-sustainable, unsustainable way of attaining your development goals is something on which all of us will have to apply our mind. And it immediately, therefore, much before I go to talking about a possible set of priorities, it immediately tells me that we have to reignite this debate on sustainable development goals. How exactly are we going to be in another 8 years? Be anywhere close to fulfilling that if the ways in which you're going to finance your development are themselves trapping you into a big debted entrapment. I mean, like debt entrapment because you're trying to move towards achieving the sustainable development goals. So ignite that debate again, talk about sustainable goals again, and in the process of achieving the sustainable development goals should be clear for all of us. For low-income countries, middle-income countries, and the process of financing has got to be a lot more poor economy, low economy, underdeveloped economy friendly. So we can't be blind to achieving the goals, forgetting the process itself. So that, I think, will broadly tell you about my first of the list, not of the final list, not of the final set of priorities, but I'm randomly without any priority, sequencing priority, putting sustainable development goals and the ways in which we are going to finance it as one of the things which will be important for us to discuss. The second, I would think, in fact, this was going to be my first, we'll have to understand how multilateral institutions, international financing institutions, are going to be a better reformed institutions. Are they going to serve with greater vigor? Have they become fatigued out? Do they have enough newer thoughts? Are they looking at modern ways of 21st century ways of leveraging what they have as funds? Do they know, or do they want to bring in greater resources? From where is this a different question, but do they want to fund themselves better? Do they want themselves to unlock the potential that they have better? And therefore, multilateral, particularly financing institutions, will be a matter of debate. I am happy the tone of it has already been set by the Honorable Prime Minister when he's been calling repeatedly for reforming institutions, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. Prime Minister is never tired of telling that these institutions will have to look at reforms. And that is something which I think is the need of the hour. And unless that is done, to whatever level, They themselves are not, I mean, this is my very off-the-cuff-ish view, they themselves are not possibly leveraging the endowments that they have optimally, nor are they probably having a plan through which they can fund themselves better for further funding countries and their developmental goals. Debt distress is something which I've already touched upon. That is definitely an issue which all of us will have to understand. The common framework, its effectiveness. Why is that even after that, not more than 2 or 3 countries have come forward to say we need some help? And even they are not very sure as to how it's going to work out. So it's not something which is appealing for countries to say, yes, we need to approach them and then we'll get the relief. So the debt distress and addressing debt distress will be an issue which we'll ideally like to talk. And you can't, even if you didn't think you need to have it in your priorities, it's certainly something which is a big elephant in the room. People will have to talk about it. How are we going to handle it? I've elaborated a lot on sustainable development, so I don't need to go into it again. That is as an area of priority. The goals, sustainable development goals, look at which countries arrived at some point or which is lagging behind. What is the last mile path? So sustainable development goals will certainly be something which I'll elaborate on and also take the priority if I can, because the goals that we've given for COP26, if I take that as the main backbone for this particular priority, after having stated nationally determined commitments, countries today are wondering if they are implementable because of the cost of the transition itself. And who's going to fund the transition? And how are we going to have technologies be made available to countries which want them? India, in fulfilling its NDCs given in COP21, has been well praised for having fairly gotten close to 100% achievement, somewhere 90% or whatever. But on many of the goals, we have really shown that we are in the ground, taking it seriously and fulfilling it. And I repeat it, possibly before you and others also, I have said this, that COP21 NDC achievement of India has been completely India's own funds based. We funded it ourselves. There was no kind of monies which came from anywhere. But I can understand that many countries which want to fulfill their NDC cannot fund it, and they're not also being facilitated with funds from anywhere else. So that is going to be a big conundrum. Even for India, for the COP26 determined commitments which Honorable Prime Minister gave there, we've also now issued a clarificatory on how our ambition is going to play out. The cost of energy, the transitional energy, the cost of technology, if and where you spot it, there is an attempt even to search for the technology. So with all this, sustainable development goal alongside UNFCCC, alongside technology and monies put on file, but put on paper, but not on table, are all issues which are staring us in our face. Can any country avoid talking about it? So if during India's presidency, we certainly need to, and I think on that score, we'll probably be standing up a bit more with, surely with self-confidence, but we'll also be able to see others taking us seriously, because we are not talking just out of the thin air. We have shown our commitment, we fulfilled our commitment. And we also have now invested in a big way for advanced storage batteries, for searching for materials, for the hydrogen mission, and investment of private nature within India, not private foreign funded, is coming in a big way into very many of these new age technologies. Solar and wind are actually already happening and much has been said, but these are areas in which you find investments coming, and our PLI policy has also enabled this process. So I would think climate finance, funding of transition, these are definitely going to be indispensable in the sense of if countries are sitting together to talk through these 12 months under our presidency, this is going to be one of those areas in which we need to try for a consensus, I would think. The other area which I'd like to credit the Japanese presidency G20 and the Italian presidency G20 also for working on it earlier, but it is also very relevant for India, is on urban infrastructure. Sustainable infrastructure, quality infrastructure. And for India, the next 25 years with PM Gati Shakti, with the very clear multimodal emphasis and making sure the resources are being optimally utilized for the sake of building India of 2047. So that is an area. And again, there, the link with the UN action plan, UN Sustainable Development Goals discussions in 2015, the Addis Ababa Declaration for Action, had so much to talk about scaling up financing, sustainable financing. That was an action plan. It wasn't just a discussion. That is 2015, the Addis Ababa Declaration. It was actually called Addis Ababa Action Plan. So they're all falling in line with infrastructure, quality infrastructure, making sure sustainable infrastructure, and therefore linked with the SDG. And 174 countries participated in it. And if 174 countries agreed on the action plan, and between 2015 and 2020, if things probably were working out as per the plan, today we have 21 and 22, which are so different. A completely new and absolutely unstable, not normal world. And how is the 2015 action plan going to be able to be adapted in today's context? Then, of course, is talking about the digital agenda, where I would certainly love to showcase India's moving speedily forward on using digital technologies, whether it is for identity, whether it is for financial inclusion. Your topic has asked me to refer to financial inclusion, improving it. So digital financial inclusion. And today, as we talk, we are aware that the Reserve Bank has started a pilot in the digital currency. So whether it is your identity, whether it is your financial inclusion, or it is basing on transfer, the governmental transfer of certain entitlements to the beneficiaries, you're looking at a revolution which is happening. The revolution is a word which I use with confidence because people have adapted it so easily. They've taken to it as fish to water. You didn't have to teach them. And that is the base on which India's digital revolution has actually succeeded, which many other countries, advanced and otherwise, are wondering how India could manage it given our scale. And also they are recognizing that we've spread it from education to health, to payments, to financial inclusion, to also identity where you need to send benefits to customers, or to make sure that family and family members are giving distinct identities and so on. So digital, if I may say, achievements of India will have to be showcased because many of the G20 members have expressed a desire to know how we could really do it. And many of them are also engaging with us to see if their systems and our systems can be interoperable. International taxation is something which I've already spoken about, but that will be an agenda to take forward because it has to really find fruition. Both the pillars will have to come effectively onto the ground. There are, of course, IMF and FSB and bodies that like that, OECD and so on have already started doing a lot of work. So we need to encourage them also to understand how crypto assets can be regulated with all countries being on the board, because no one single country can succeed in individually being in a silo and trying to regulate the crypto assets. I use the word crypto assets because I distinctly would stand outside of the RBI, which is bringing in the currency, and talk about the world which prevails outside, where assets are being created and traded, regulating them in national interest, because you don't know what the trail leads you to. Is it a drug funding? Is it terror funding? Or is it just gaming the system? And so on. So that regulation cannot be successful if any one country does it. We have not come out with any plans as yet. So we need to have all the members of the G20, first of all, come on board to see how best it can be done. I know work has been done by FSB, OECD, IMF, and also the BIS. So we'll have to bring all of them together and then put it on the table for the members to have a meaningful conversation on it. I have not mentioned the two big items which people normally keep referring in these days: food security and energy security. Energy security, I've sort of referred to it from the point of view of sustainability, but immediate requirements of countries for the energy requirements, and also the food security, which again today and since yesterday has become another point of discussion because of the disruption which is happening in shipping grains through the Black Sea. So these are issues which definitely are already there. So broadly, I would think these are the kind of issues with which we'll have to take the G20 forward. I've given you a sketch of it, but I suppose we'll have to wait just a few more days before it is finalized. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for your wonderful sort of overview of what's on the plate or might be on the plate, as you want me to emphasize. It's not a done deal, but it certainly covers a very wide waterfront and a very interesting set of issues. Honorable Finance Minister has agreed to answer 2 or 3 questions. So if I could have 1 or 2 people